En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible. Al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar. Apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.
A very good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of you, depending on where you are joining us for. Thank you for joining us. It is a great pleasure to have you with us for this seminar called Telling and Making Visible Environmental Challenges from the Perspective of Indigenous Stories. This is a topic that brings us together as journalists all over Latin America and all people who come to visit our Indigenous peoples. It's about the importance of telling these stories that come from different parts of the marvelous cultures that we have in Latin America and that we must continue to understand each passing day. We have a cycle of 4 seminars that are given by Fundación Gabo with the Pulitzer Center, the ISA Group, and the Conexión Jaguar program. It is a great pleasure that for us to tell you that if you would like to listen to us in English, we do have simultaneous interpreting available, and you can follow the instructions that are given here in our live comments to listen to that English interpretation. And so English will be available the whole time. Para las personas que hablan inglés o cualquier otro idioma y quieren seguir el seminario en su idioma, tenemos un servicio de traducción simultánea en inglés. Para accederla, va a estar disponible durante todo el seminario. Simplemente tienen que seguir las instrucciones que tenemos acá en los comentarios. Welcome everybody once again. We are very happy to have you here with us. We have fantastic panelists with us today. I'm joining you from Bolivia, and we have guests from the United States who actually now lives in Colombia. We have a guest from Peru, and we have Amal from Colombia. This is a very diverse and representative group when it comes to representing the diverse voices that we have in Latin America. Our first panelist is Tom LaFay. He has a great deal of experience working with Indigenous peoples, despite the fact that he was born in the United States. He is a visual journalist. He focuses more than anything else on photography and audio-visual documentaries in Latin America. He's been located in Colombia since 2016, where he covers violence against human rights defenders, particularly during the turbulent peace process in the country, and the diverse problems that are faced in the Amazon region. We're going to hear a little bit about Tom's work. He is part of the team and has received a subsidy from the Pulitzer Center for crisis reports investigating mercury trafficking in the Guyana Shield. Tom, please tell us a little more about your work and welcome. Thank you very much. A very good morning to you all. Firstly, I would like to thank Fundación Gabo for this fantastic invitation. It's a great honor to be with you, with Amal and with Nelly and with Natalie and Camilo, and also thank you to the whole technical team, and of course all of the audience joining us from different places around the world. So speaking about reporting in Indigenous territory, it's worth mentioning, I believe, I'm speaking to you from Bogota, Colombia, and this is the ancestral land of the Muisca people, so I'd like to recognize the traditional owners of this land. What I wanted to do today is to share a little bit of my work with you, working together with the Siobain people, also known as the Siona people in the Putumayo in the south of Colombia. I'm in the middle of carrying out a feature film documentary, and it talks about the identity and spirituality of the Siobain people and their defense of the Amazon region. I don't know if my presentation is available for us to put on screen. Thank you. I do apologize, I'm new to this format. Next slide, please. This is a project that I started in 2019. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the relationship between forest journalists and Indigenous communities, in this case, the Siona people. So I'd like to share 2 minutes of a short film that I just shot for The New Yorker in the United States in June of this year, and then talk about or analyze the 2 minutes that I show you. As a journalist and a participant in telling the story. So could we please show the video and then continue with the presentation? Thank you.
Anteriormente nuestros abuelos eran más poderosos porque no había grupos armados, no había de pronto las multinacionales. Ha sido todo lo que ha venido afectando, entonces Ya estamos más pocos. Ya va a ser imposible la protección espiritualmente.
Muy buenos días. Yo sé que este camino no es fácil y tampoco imposible.
Este trabajo sea en conjunto para que la comunidad hoy sientan de que sus tierras están siendo liberadas para poder volver a ejercer sus actividades.
Aquí nuevamente, pese a lo que pese, y estoy dispuesta a trabajar por mi comunidad. Turupa.
Anhelo y sueño, cuando yo ya esté ancianita, algo otros jóvenes se incluyan y digan, estamos defendiendo el territorio y este es nuestro legado. Porque sabemos que estamos cultivando el aire, ese aire le va a servir a un país que de pronto no lo tiene. Entonces solamente no es para nosotros, es para el mundo.
Thank you very much. Could we please move to the next slide? So, first off, I'd like to mention that the Siona people are, and this is according to the Constitutional Court in Colombia, endangered in terms of their culture and physically due to the armed conflict. So that's a little bit of the context there, because what I wanted to touch upon is that the idea that known as taitas amongst the Siona people is the idea of seeing, thinking, and listening. And I think that that's a topic that for any journalist is absolutely fundamental, but especially when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples and looking at being accepted, becoming a part of the group, at least to a small degree, in this case the Siona. That's fundamental. You need to be able to see what is happening, but you also need to think about it properly, and you also need to listen to have an understanding of the different paradigms involved in the situations at hand. So when Ariela, who is the main character in the documentary, and she works in demining because the armed conflict left behind a lot of mines in the Siona land, and her work has been to demine the territory so that her people can return to it. When she speaks about what's happening there, she says that the elders in the group used to be more powerful, and that is related to many different aspects. There were more elders. They had greater power to move people, and as the land itself has been affected by mines and different types of destruction, for example, this explosive device or IED, what that has meant is that there have been limitations placed on the Siona people. They can't walk around their land, they can't enjoy it, they can't use it for hunting, and that affects their spiritual ceremonies. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the topic of confinement, which is also an environmental and cultural threat. And in working with the Siona and looking for a short story that we could get ready in the short term for a US media outlet, and also a story that Western people could see and understand, but also at the same time wanting to make sure that it wouldn't be too obvious, well, we decided to tell the story of landmines. These IEDs, improvised explosive devices, have led to that limitation, that restriction. People are not able to be on the land. And also the possibility of actually being on the land enables people to protect it, to live it, and if they can't access the land, obviously they can't defend it or enjoy it. We also see environmental destruction from oil companies. These are all risks that are all woven together or interconnected when it comes to the violation of the land, as we might call it. And Adiela in the documentary talks about how she hopes that the young people, the young Siona, will become defenders of the land or advocates. This is extremely important and of great interest to many journalists who are familiar with or just starting to become familiar with working with Indigenous peoples in Colombia or Ecuador or Peru or other countries. And that topic is, of course, Indigenous Guardians. They're called Kuriakwa in amongst the Siona. They're not necessarily defenders, they care for the land. They stand out and are distinguished, differentiated as having an important role. It's not about defending, because that's a very Western concept, but they care for the land. As was mentioned in the Jaguar organization video, everything is interconnected. And if we want to have a healthy environment, that's going to have an impact on all aspects of life, and that is where the Kurikwa come into the picture. Here we also have a reflection on the importance of listening and spending time with elders. Next slide, please. It's about learning and also passing this knowledge on to coming generations. That's key. I'm just brushing over these topics to give you an idea and an image of what we might want to talk about in more detail later on. Next slide, please. And I'd like to close with this phrase, which I find to be both fundamental and beautiful. Adiela, as a young leader, says that the Siona people, which is also a small group, I think there are some 2,000 inhabitants or members of the group today, she says, we are cultivating air, and that air is for a country that would otherwise not necessarily have it. So there you can see that they're taking agency. They're able to support and also teach the rest of the world. They're doing their part. And I think that when we work as journalists or Indigenous communicators, I think these are messages that we need to make an effort to understand from the Indigenous perspective, so that we can also transmit that message to a Western audience. And here, a memory of a Siona colleague of mine who's starting out as a filmmaker. Next slide, please. And here we finish in the jungle, which is where much knowledge is passed on between generations from elders to youngsters. And they are currently going through a cultural renaissance and also a renaissance of protection with their Indigenous carers or guardians. So I'll stop there and we can continue to talk during the session. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for sharing a little of your work with us. I think it's very interesting to see the stories of Indigenous Latin American peoples is not something that only us Latin Americans are passionate about, but it's something that also draws attention of members of other cultures, and that also enriches how these stories are told, or how the problems that our Indigenous people face are narrated. So thinking of that, I think that an initial question I'd like to ask you specifically is related to how you approached or became close to Latin American groups. I've read your bio, and you were studying political science, and during that time you had some contact with Latin American migrants who had moved to the United States to work in farming or in agriculture. So I see that that may have been a first moment of contact with Latin American cultures for you, and perhaps that's where you started to become interested in them, which later led you to decide to move to Colombia and stay to work from Colombia. So can you tell us, how did your interest in Indigenous Latin American groups start? Was there some kind of key story or moment that led you to make the decision to come or go and live in Colombia and narrate these Indigenous stories? Well, that's a long time ago, but, well, I'm still young, right? But yes, this path started more than 10 years ago. I was studying in South Carolina in the United States. I was studying political sciences and Latin American studies, as you mentioned, and I went to work on a farm in the mountains of North Carolina. It was only 4 months, no more than that, but I was there working shoulder to shoulder with Mexican migrants, in that case from Acapulco, from Mexico City, from Querétaro. So those were my colleagues or workmates. And I think when you're young, it's also very interesting, or you're attracted by hearing stories of how the peoples live, or in this case, Latin American migrants. There are also many indigenous groups in North America because we started as migrants as well. But it was interesting for me to see how my workmates had to live in the shadows or on the fringes of the law in order to be able to work and survive. Obviously, that made a huge impression on me. And while I continued studying, I had the opportunity to go to Central America, and essentially I lived for 4 years in Central America, in Nicaragua and El Salvador. I started to work on documentaries and to look at these topics until the situation in Nicaragua became politically extremely difficult. They were getting rid of or taking out a lot of journalists in 2016. So I had some friends and contacts here in Colombia, so it seemed to me to be a place that I could use as a base to work from. But really, getting close to indigenous topics, that was more during the peace process here in Colombia, and just as I was starting to become familiar with Colombia, I saw that during the supposed peace process there was a lot of violence against indigenous social leaders all over the country. Daniel Bustos and Emily Bright, a couple of my filmmaking colleagues, we believed it was really important, fundamental to investigate what was happening and document the situation that was occurring, because the large media outlets, mass media, were only talking about peace in Colombia. And what was happening is that every 2 or 3 days there was another murder in the Cauca region, in the Sierra Nevada, in Putumayo, in Meta. So little by little, or really, I would say I just threw myself into it. I started working with CAHAR, which is the Restrepo Lawyers Collective, to put together some portraits of social leaders and defenders. And then we did a documentary focused in the north of the Cauca region, which had been most heavily impacted by the conflict. And in doing so, we of course came into contact with the NASA indigenous group, who were and who are the most severely threatened and attacked by this violence. And that closeness with Feliciano Valencia, who's a NASA leader, who participated in that documentary, that was the start of getting closer and spending time in NASA hamlets or small villages, spending time with communities. But that's how it happened. Thank you very much, Tom. We're now going to hear from our next guest, Amal Villafana, who is joining us. He has a great deal of experience. He has been working on Indigenous narratives in many years. He's a social communicator, photographer, and filmmaker. He's part of the Arhuaca community, and he started working in 2005, focusing on the protection of the Sierra Nevada, which is a mountainous area in the Colombian Caribbean region. He has held photographic exhibitions where he tries to raise awareness about the importance of the Sierra Nevada, and one of his most outstanding documentaries, Naoba, and also Palabras Mayores, Palabras de Mamos, amongst others. He has published a book and a great deal to share with us. Amal, welcome, and thank you for being here with us. I think Amal was having some internet issues, but he'll be back with us in just a moment. But we are ready to hear from him so he can tell us a little more about his work, and also for him to show us what he's working on at the moment, which is about the Colombian territory. Welcome back, Amal. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to share this space with you, with all of you. Before I give my presentation, I've just had a small technical issue here. Could you please repeat the questions you just asked me, because I disconnected for a moment. I disconnected just for a moment. I don't know what happened. Yes, we can hear you. The idea is for you to give us your presentation, talk about your work, and then we'll go to the round of questions. So, questions from the panel and from the audience. I spoke with Camila, and the idea is to show a little bit of the Sierra Nevada visually with the last piece of work I've been doing last year. I think that's how we've scheduled things. Hi, I'm Amal Villafana. I'm a member of the Arhuaco tribal group. We have 4 indigenous groups in the Sierra Nevada: Cogui, Caguamo, Arhuaco, and the Wiwa. This is an independent mountainous region, independent of the main mountain chain, and basically I became part of this strategy of raising awareness and making visible our stories due to the violence in Colombia. It's not something that I necessarily leaned towards, taking photographs or making documentaries. What happened was that in 2002, violence here became very grave here in the Sierra Nevada, and we as Indigenous peoples got stuck in the middle of a conflict. And so I was told that we had to start to raise awareness about what was happening, because we couldn't respond to the situation with more violence. And so that's how I started to think about publishing a book and making a documentary. And I've continued to do so because of violence, but really more than anything for our land. That's what's most important for us. We always come in peace as Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Amal. We've got your video ready to go, so you're going to show us a bit of your work. So what we could do is watch the video and then continue with our conversation. Thank you, Amal. Okay. Say Antwi, Communicating Worlds, Director Amal Villafana, the Arhuaco people. Spiritual communication was established when the universe began. The power to have this spiritual communication lies with us, the mamos, or local shamans. Our responsibility is to converse with the spirits that own nature. We speak not only with people's spirits, but also with the spirits of everything that exists. The spirit of everything lives here in these mountains. My traditional name is Sarwawin. I am responsible for spiritually guiding this community. I have to ask myself what my eyes see. And I see enormous changes that concern me. Why are these changes happening? It's because we have stopped doing what we have to do in accordance with our law of origin. The beliefs that we have inherited are becoming weakened. And that's why our water levels are dropping and our snow-capped mountains are disappearing. The 4 indigenous groups here in the Sierra Nevada have come together, and we have agreed on a solution. I am on my way to fulfill the mandate that's been communicated to us by the spirits. We have to give an offering to the Mother of Water, and only children of pure heart can do so. If we lose our original connection with the world's spirits, humanity will not be able to live well. The destruction of nature is weakening the spirit of food. Our needs are growing and new illnesses are appearing. And the risk is that we will disappear. Can you hear me? Yes, Amal, we can hear you. Please tell us a little bit about your work. So we were able to see just a couple of minutes. How was it carrying out the project? And what is, in your eyes, the importance of your people being able to use audiovisual tools to tell the world about Arhuaco traditions? Well, initially it was something very difficult because out on the land we have the mother, the father, and sacred spaces where basically what we do is we fulfill a law of origin, so when you take photographs of that, it's all laid bare. Isakuriwa is the entry gate to the spirit of snow. It's the basis of snow, and only children can make the offering. I'm sorry, was there a connection problem again? But basically, we had to work with our traditional authorities, with our political authorities, and we also had to work professionally, because the idea was to make visible or raise awareness about our situation for a non-Indigenous audience. So what's most important is, when it comes to the defense of human rights, is the right to territory. For us to be well, we have to take care of our territory. The mountains, which represent the man, water, which is man, trees, which represent the man, and earth, which represent the woman. And so for us to be well, they have to also be well. That's very important. It's also important that the snows stay on the mountains, because the snow is what maintains the stability of our climate and our weather, and also that guarantee us water. So when the snows start to disappear, that's because we have violated the law of origin. Us as Indigenous peoples and the rest of the world, it's because we've stopped fulfilling or obeying that law. So I started taking photographs in 2002. I've been doing it now for 18 years. The main aim of what I do is to contribute and to be able to leave behind an archive where people can see what we have been doing to conserve our culture and territory. And over the last 18 years, I've been able to put together an enormous amount of material, unpublished video material and photographs. And so my immediate work is to organize my archives. You also mentioned the publication of a book. We've already published 2. And we're now working on publishing a 3rd book. It will be a history book with many archives that have been recovered from 1914. And so that's what we're doing right now. But I'd just like to repeat once again that the threats that we see to our land on the environmental front, we always say that for us as Indigenous peoples, the environmental conservation is something that is always important to us. It's not something momentary or temporary. It's a principle for us. So in our culture, we grow up, we reproduce, we die. It's the natural life cycle. And so our land is very important to guarantee that our culture and our lives can be maintained. I think there's a lot more that I could say, but I won't go on too much. I'll stop, and if there are any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. Thank you, Amal. Thank you for showing us all of your work. We will have a round of questions later on, so anyone who would like to ask a question, please send them through. We are receiving them. Now let's continue with our next guest, Nelly Amancio, who will be joining us, or who is joining us from Peru, who also has a great deal of experience in journalistic research and investigation and is an expert in the field in Latin America. I there refer to work with Indigenous people. She is the general editor of Ojo Público. She's an investigative journalist and she works a lot on topics of the environment, human rights and power, and has received many awards. The most important of these, Data Journalism Award in 2015 and 2020, and also the Excellency Award from the Inter-American Press Organization, amongst many other awards. She's also been co-editor of a book, Poderes Fácticos, Tiempos de Crisis, and she also works with the ICIJ. Now let's hand over to Nelly for her to share her presentation with us. Thank you very much for being with us. Welcome. Hi everybody, thank you very much to the Jaguar Foundation and the Pulitzer Group for this invitation. It's fantastic to hear about the other panelists' work. It was great to see Amalio's work just a couple of minutes ago. I'm going to share my screen so I can give you my presentation. Okay, now you should be able to see it, right? Yes. Yes, Nelly, now we can see your presentation. Thank you. So to get started, just a little bit about Ojo Público. We are a small independent digital media outlet. We are going to celebrate 6 years of existence this year. From the beginning, the idea was to work with a regional perspective. Peru has 24 regions, 60% of our territory is Amazon, and amongst that diversity we have 55 indigenous groups. So the journalism that we practice at Ojo Público is based on telling stories at the regional level, but also at a national level. We want to cover topics that affect those territories. Additionally, we look at the cross-border impact of these stories. I'll go into more detail about that later on, but organized crime, for example, crosses borders. It doesn't respect those geographic limits, and that has an impact on indigenous peoples in Peru and Brazil, Peru and Bolivia, and Peru and Colombia, for example. So this cross-border perspective is something that we look at in a more integrated manner from the media perspective. It's about having a better understanding of territorial complexity and the different actors or stakeholders involved there. For the last 4 years, we have been putting together a regional investigative network, which includes Indigenous reporters. We have 10 Indigenous reporters in 24 regions. We have various correspondents. 2 of them are Indigenous correspondents who live in Indigenous communities and speak Indigenous languages, and so they're part of our investigative projects. At the same time, we also have an external contributor network in other Amazon countries or Amazon territory countries to cover those cross-border topics. So what we try to do is to work in formats that will reach not only digital audiences, but also to work with other formats for communities or areas where there is not an internet connection or coverage. We've started printing stories, for example, or putting together short pieces, podcasts that we distribute, which we use to distribute verified content for Indigenous people in local Indigenous languages, and we do that through community media outlets who are our main partners out in the field, not only for telling stories but also for spreading them. When it comes to the construction of our narrative, we have a working ideas group. We look at how to tell Indigenous stories. I started as a journalist in 2005, and since 2006, more or less, I've been covering Indigenous topics. And I think that one of the main needs that we have when it comes to traditional media or other media in general is there is an increasingly lower number of correspondents out in regional areas. Many correspondent offices have been closed in Peru, and so there's been a sacrifice of the importance of local reporters and Indigenous reporters out in Indigenous territories. And so that means that narratives are almost always constructed from our cities. So whenever there's, for example, an environmental or social conflict, it's only recently that traditional media have started to incorporate Indigenous problems into their agenda, but they always do so from a perspective of conflict. And what they do is they put together a working group and send that group to the area where the conflict occurs. I think it's important and timely for us as media workers to operate within this context, and understand the importance of having a network of sources in every sense of the word. So if we want to understand what's happening in territorial areas, we need to make sure that we have Indigenous sources, that they are members of Indigenous groups, and that will enable us to put together texts or investigative reports, whatever format, from a much more intercultural perspective. Another thing that I'd like to share with you is that a lot of the time, based on my experience, I used to work in quite a large media outlet here in Peru. Indigenous groups were seen as a matter or a topic to be included within the environment or regional sections of the paper. It was as if they couldn't be actors or main characters in the politics section or the economic section. And so whenever there was a social conflict, which was the only way for Indigenous peoples to appear in the media in the first place, the perspective was always, look, there's a conflict, there's a face-off between Indigenous group and this extractive industry, and that was the narrative. And what was in fact happening, and now we're much clearer on this, is that these social conflict matters require or involve a much more economic perspective. It's about the power of negotiation, which often involves that issue of power. It's Indigenous community groups talking with or trying to negotiate with these large extractive companies. So in the media, we have to incorporate the coverage of Indigenous peoples from a much more transversal or cross-cutting perspective. And we need to take those stories out of their traditional places, which is again in the environmental or regional sections. Another challenge is fighting against stereotypes. The images and the narratives, the stories that are told. For example, the first time that we go to the Amazon or have contact with an isolated group serve usually just to reinforce stereotypes. A lot of the time, the stories that are told are really charged with paternalism, because it's that city-centric perspective that we've been taught for so long. And that's the perspective that you often translate into your texts. I remember the first stories that I wrote in my first years as a journalist, and I'm very clear, I can affirm that I would, if I could go back and write them again, I would not write them in the same way. The images selected when you edit, why do we always select, for example, images of Indigenous people wearing traditional dress? Why are those images always present amongst the images, when in their daily lives Indigenous peoples don't necessarily use their traditional dress? Surely in many cases more comfortable to just wear a t-shirt and shorts. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have when it comes to constructing a journalistic narrative of Indigenous peoples without paternalism and without stereotypes. And when it's about making visible or raising awareness of Indigenous narratives, sometimes we think it's enough to simply go and cover the problems or the issues that are occurring amongst an Indigenous group. And what I think is that what we really have to do is incorporate voices in our different editorial communication processes. I'll give you some examples later on in my presentation about how we can incorporate, for example, Indigenous columnists. Usually columnists in traditional media are legal or health or economics professionals in the opinion section, but why aren't we giving the same political and economic weight to an Indigenous leader or voice with his or her own perspective and cosmovision? That's a necessary effort that needs to be made, in my opinion, and needs to be included in editorial processes in different media. The other point here is related to respect. Something that I learned very early on is that the notion of time that you work with in the city is different to the notion of time in Indigenous groups. We might have, for example, a travel schedule to go out and cover a story, but your travel structure with your schedule, with your timings, might not necessarily align with the community's timings. They might need to have a community assembly to decide upon your entry into the community, for example. So that knowledge and that experience is related to respect, but also being aware of the different levels of organizational power that Indigenous communities use to organize themselves. Something additional that I believe to be very important when it comes to constructing Indigenous narratives is related to understanding that journalism is different to activism. In environmental journalism, there's a lot of debate around whether or not journalists should be activists. I personally believe that we should not be. And that's also part of the effort that we make at Ojo Público. We believe that activism is extremely important in the different spaces that it takes place and the different fights that it takes on, but it's important that journalism fulfills its role, which is more about trying to get close to the truth, as close as possible to the truth, even if that sometimes goes against our own beliefs or fights or prejudices. So, with that said, I'd now like to show you some examples of how we are trying to work with the Indigenous narrative at Ojo Público. This is a report that we published last year, and we decided to do it. This was something different to other stories that we had published. Instead of using images or photographs, which are of course extremely valuable, in this case we invited an Asheninka painter, Enrique Casanto Shingari, and he represented a problem that was occurring in his group, some murders that had occurred in a Peruvian group located on the border with Brazil. This is called the Azueto murder case because they murdered here 4 Indigenous leaders, and Enrique here gave us 4 paintings that we passed into a digital format to accompany our report. This is a painting. It's about how he understands the Soweto community sees it following the murders. So here we have the 4 leaders who were murdered. Here Enrique represents them in the company of the different gods who will accompany them in the transition to death. We have a jaguar, a sun, or the sun and the moon, amongst others. This is how Enrique sees the murder. This is when they found the 4 murdered leaders. And this is the exact moment when the illegal loggers who were on the border were found by the Indigenous leaders just minutes before they were killed. Something else that we've started to do this year, and I'd like to share this audio piece with you, is to do a fact-checking program. We've had it for quite a long time, but now in the pandemic, what we've started to see is that almost all information is associated with social networks and WhatsApp groups, and so many communities are getting that information and starting to use erroneous treatments for COVID, and that's placing the health at risk. And in many cases, they're being tricked into doing so. So in this case, they were told that the coca leaf cured COVID-19, and that is not the case. So what we've started to do this year is to translate these fact-checking pieces into Indigenous languages. We're doing this in Quechua, Wahun, and Shipiwa. Peru has 55 Indigenous languages, so we hope that we will eventually be able to include or incorporate other languages into this project. This is the column that I mentioned to you. Here we have Leonardo Teo Imaina. He's an Indigenous individual who lives on the Colombia-Peruvian border, and here he's written a column in our opinion section, and he speaks about the importance, or how important it is that medical science come together with Indigenous knowledge, and that it take into account the value of the traditional plants and treatments in the Amazon. I think one of the quotes that for me was most powerful in this column is that he says, medicines and vaccines are important, but much more important is not to harm nature where people's lives are harmonized. And there's a testimonial video that he has recorded that goes along with that column. Something else that we do in Ojo Público is a lot of the time we talk about Indigenous groups in the Amazon, but we also have other groups in the Andes, or the Andean mountain chain, and the Sierra. In Peru we have the Quechua people, and in the investigations we've carried out looking at water use at the national level and the water use by extractive industries, we published this special report, and it's the first time that a complete special was published in Quechua. It was also translated into Spanish and English, in this case because many of the companies involved in extractive activities, irregular extractive activities, are involved with foreign capital and are English speaking. Here we wanted to make visible one of the most spoken languages in our national territory, Quechua. Here is the version in English. I'd like to share this final video with you. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It did work when we did our tests, so let's see if it will work now.
Pokadu trabajo, COVID-19 achema, coisiu na haima vetsiku na duka kaskichu. Redes sociales aina no michichena, pokadu trabajo, coronavirus achema vetsiku. Tu mais periodista público da Kenya no chini mas de trabajo para kaskichu.
I don't know if you were able to see the video properly, but that's part of the fact-checking video series, so that's in Wahun. And we've also converted this into short audio clips to be able to share these with different community radio stations that we have partnerships with, as well as with community Indigenous organizations. So that's a little bit of what we do at Ojo Público. Thank you very much, Nelly, for sharing your work with us. We are now going to move on to a round of questions so that we can go into more detail about what each of you has said in your presentation. So now, in these kinds of spaces, we are always very grateful, of course, to Fundación Gabo and Garcia Marquez, who has been so important for each of us in our careers, and is one of the reasons we're here. I think it's really important to highlight that Latin American cultures share this richness, as well as all the problems. Usually when we talk about the problems in Indigenous communities or in Latin American countries, regardless of which country we're in, we can identify with them. And so this brings to mind a phrase that Gabo always said. He said even though he felt Caribbean and the Caribbean was his home, his mother or fatherland was that he was a native to all Latin American countries. So with that in mind, we are now going to share the experiences that you've each had as journalists. I'm going to ask a question for you to each respond to it. So you can each give me your perspective, taking into account that we have all worked with Indigenous peoples. So what's key for a good report amongst an Indigenous group is to generate trust. And a lot of the time, what needs to happen is that a meeting of Indigenous leaders needs to occur to decide whether or not a journalist can enter that community. And I think that ties into what Nelly said, the difference between city notions of time and Indigenous notions of time. So what advice would you give to journalists who are interested in working with Indigenous communities so that they can maintain respect for local concepts of time and a good relationship. I don't know who would like to start. I think ladies first. I was actually looking at Amalo. I think if it's the first time you're going to go to an unknown territory, what's important is to think of some basic protocols. To enter a community, these are related to security and also coverage. Firstly, you have to understand the territory. Where are you going? What altitude does it lie at? Who lives in that territory? Is it just one Indigenous group? Are there 2 or 3? You need to identify leaders. Something that's fundamental is it's not just about a journalist arriving at a community's doorstep and saying, I'm going to put up my tent and I'm going to camp out here with you. There's a structure and protocols that need to be followed. And communities themselves are much clearer on this organization. Every single community, no matter how small it is, will correspond to a larger Indigenous organization. This might be groups that are joined, for example, by a river or a basin. They'll be part of a regional Indigenous organization, and that regional organization will be part of the national organization. So if you are Peruvian and you want to go and work with an Indigenous community for the first time, you need to first off go to the national Indigenous organization and then go down the ranks. Obviously, if you can directly make contact with a local community, that's even better, but often you need to start at that national level. For international journalists, first off, always start with the national Indigenous organization because they're more accustomed to working with international journalists and also have a better understanding of timelines that are needed and might act as a better guide for you to enter the community better than a local or regional organization. And then I think once you've dealt with that logistics aspect, what's most difficult is for you to deal with your own prejudices and leave them behind. How can you get rid of your own preconceptions about what you are going to find in the community? I've had to travel many times with international journalists for some coverages or stories, and the question I've been frequently asked is, why aren't these people wearing their traditional dress? And they would ask the Indigenous peoples to put on traditional dress to take photos of them. That's understandable because we've been told again and again that Indigenous peoples always wear their traditional dress, but it's not when they're just at home or cooking or looking after their kids that they're wearing traditional dress. So we need to get rid of our own preconceptions, and that for me is the biggest challenge. And in fact, it's still challenging for me, but it's one of the main recommendations that I would like to give. I think we have a great rich diversity of perspectives here from different places. So I would love now to hear from Amal from his perspective. When he's had to welcome or receive journalists, how has he done that as an Indigenous communicator to work with his peers? Well, as Nelly has just said, in the Sierra Nevada there are 4 Indigenous groups. We do have a national organization, which is the Tairon Indigenous Organization. It's actually Arhuaca, but also each Indigenous group has its own organization, Community Council. So the images and the knowledge that is gained through these reports is collective property. We have an internal agreement amongst our Indigenous groups that has to be followed with regards to that. So whether we're talking about a Colombian or an international journalist coming to work with us, the first thing is to make contact with a local governor and present the project that he or she has in mind to see if the governor can be convinced of that project and if it aligns with the internal agreements that we have. And the journalist must also sign a document in which he or she declares that the story that's produced is not the property of the journalist, but rather that material is shared property, shared with the organization, the Indigenous organization at hand. And also the images produced should be used only for the specific project. It's not a matter of, oh, I took the photo and I'm going to publish it here, here, and there. No, that image is tied to that agreement. That's the pathway to work with us. And we also are very clear that as Indigenous people, we have to work hand in hand with you. We're working here with a visual language for a non-Indigenous audience. Thank you, Amalo. In your experience, Tom, how have you worked with Indigenous communities? What is your advice for a journalist approaching an unknown community? So I am here to offer the perspective of a foreign journalist, no? I think as a foreign journalist, and here I agree with Nelly, as a foreigner, you have even greater responsibility to understand where you are going, the context of where you're going, not only the cultural context, and this is aimed at other foreign journalists that have worked or who want to work in Indigenous areas. What you have to do is to look at security. Firstly, you need to take into account the security of the Indigenous group itself. If you're going out to a territorial area, that might attract negative attention. So firstly, you have to consult with the Indigenous organization at hand or coordinate with the Indigenous leader. You need to talk to the community council, the Cabildo, and you have to show your proposed project. And what I think you need to have clear, and you need to be honest about your goal. And if your proposal is accepted, well, then you can go ahead. You always need to also take into account the comments you receive. So maybe the community council says, look, it's fine for you to film and work in this area, but don't go over such and such a line. Don't go over that border, because perhaps there is an armed group operating in the area, or you're not able to cross that line because it's a sacred area, a spiritual area, or, well, for whatever reason, they don't want you to go into that area. So this is all based on respect more than anything else. You always need to take into account that your actions might have an unseen impact. I have another question for Amalo, and then Nelly and Tom, you could maybe comment on it as well. Amalo, you've said in the past, I read in an interview that you gave, Indigenous communicators should not imitate white communicators in terms of the form of narrating a story, nor in terms of artistic or poetic sensibility. And you insist on the importance of training new communicators, but with Indigenous teachers or masters, not with white masters, because there's a different understanding in Indigenous communities than to the understanding in the city. Could you tell me more about that? As I said at the beginning, we use cameras in a completely different way. I always say that you, as white people, have had the opportunity to just lean towards what you want to do. But we, as Indigenous people, have to use these tools as tools of protection. So it's very important for Indigenous documentary makers to take into account how they're going to narrate and interpret the voices of our spiritual and political authorities. We need to make sure that they are heard. That can be done through subtitles, for example, to make sure that people can understand what's being said in other languages. I've worked a lot with Stephen Ferry, Pablo Mora from Bogota, Stephen Ferry from the United States. And whenever we work together, we say, okay, look, we're working on a project directed at a non-Indigenous audience, so we have to work together. And so you need to have a team made up of Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. That's extremely important. Let me repeat once again that in the credits, if you've made a documentary, your name appears next to the role that you fulfilled, your position. If you're an editor, you're an editor, producer, but at the end of the day, that documentary is joint property of the journalist and the Indigenous organization at hand. I believe it is necessary that young people start to train as communicators, but not from the perspective of journalism, but rather seeing these audiovisual tools as a bridge that serves to protect our territory and our culture. You're not just a reporter, you're an authority. We have to have Indigenous communicators who are connected to the land and the spiritual aspect. That's a great responsibility. So, I've said what I had to say. So what Amalo has just said leads me to something, or connects with something that Nelly said earlier about the need to carry out collaborations with Indigenous peoples, reporters and columnists, even with Indigenous artists. You can work with other formats like painting and music. There are different ways to collaborate. So Nelly, tell us in more detail, how has your experience of starting to train these new journalists, what has that been like for you in terms of helping us to understand the Indigenous narrative? I think it's a complex rather than complicated challenge. As Amalo has just said, the role of, or the Indigenous commitment is also a commitment to activism, because they have to defend their rights that have been violated for so long. So we carry out investigative journalism at Ojo Público. So all of the training and support that we provided to Indigenous journalists at the beginning as we put together our network, well, really the question we asked ourselves at the beginning was, where's the balance? What's the line between rigorous information and activism, without, of course, imposing a narrative on our Indigenous colleagues? Finding that balance between the Indigenous journalist's commitment to his or her territory and, on the other hand, city-based editors saying, look, this is not the right adjective, we have to check these facts, we need to check these sources, we need to incorporate other sources. That process was very enriching. I did suffer a bit, but at the same time, I would say actually we all suffered a little bit with the Awajun journalist who we worked with in the Amazon, but it was a mutual learning process. I think it's really important to explore those balances between investigative journalism, where we always try to be rigorous and keep to the facts, and combining that with that commitment to land and that other perspective. And I think that other media outlets should do this. It's not about timing. It's not as if we're publishing on a permanent basis. But I think that the weight here is on how we transmit these new working processes and that heritage that Amal has just referred to, because these new journalists have to use their own perspectives to train other journalists. And so for us, the central question has been, what can we do to have a new generation of Indigenous journalists carrying out investigative journalism, for example? Thank you, Nelly. Tom, do you have anything to add? And we'll then receive a question from our audience. Just something I'd like to say, something very short. In the feature film-length documentary that we are now doing with the Zioain group, we are also trying to find a way to do this collaboratively, making it fair and taking into account the differences in terms of how we approach editing. For example, we do the editing work here in Bogota, and what we do is we take trips out to the territory, usually for 2 weeks at a time, to the Putumayo region. I work on the production side with some members of the community. I even work with Taita Pablo, and his role is not only to participate or as a participant in the documentary, but also he is a producer, you could say. What we do is we sit down together and we look at the material. But you also have to learn about the right way to work with people. What happens a lot of the time is I take a trip out to the Siobayan territory. I'm really eager to show him one of the pieces I've edited. One night passes, the second night passes. I'm eager, but I have to be calm about it. Basically, we'll look at the edited piece when the time is right, when he's ready. We sit down together, we look at it properly, we analyze it, I listen to what he has to say. And something else, this doesn't really lie upon me to talk about. This is something for the elders to speak about. Sometimes we need to take traditional medicines or remedies there, and then during that ceremony think about the material and talk about the material. And so once that's been done, I feel confident that we've found the right direction to take. I mention this because this project, and without getting into details about how I got involved with the Siona people, basically I wanted to collaborate, or they wanted to collaborate, with a filmmaker because they're going through a difficult time. It's really a learning process. It needs respect, it needs time, and if we have those elements, we'll find a way to tell the story together. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to all of you for your answers. We have one last question from our audience, from the public. So, what is the best way to involve the public within Indigenous stories based on their own individual experiences? Nelly. I'm sorry, I'm not clear on the question. How do we involve the public? Okay, I'm talking here about participatory audiences. That's very in fashion in journalism, no? To get the audience to participate and the public feels part of the story. How can we achieve that when we cover Indigenous stories? I think it would be very ambitious as digital media outlets located in the city to try to directly reach them, because we have an enormous digital gap here which limits access to information on the part of Indigenous communities in isolated territories, for example. And there's also the issue of access. The best thing you can do, I believe, and this is part of our strategy at Ojo Público, we work in partnership with local community radio stations, and we put stories together with them. These are joint projects. So we have partnerships with Indigenous organizations that have, for example, radio stations that broadcast in a river basin. They're small, but they're powerful because they have a specific audience, or at the same time they're very, very familiar with the problems occurring locally. So we put together a mixed team of Ojo Público reporters with these local radio stations, and then based on that we create content. And our partners, our local partners, use radio broadcasts. They receive communications from communities that do not have internet access. We would love everybody to have internet access, but it's still a dream. So in the meantime, communication is still via radio broadcast for many communities, and these community broadcasts or community radio stations are best equipped to transmit this information. There's a lot of information in the Amazon transmitted via USBS, and in that way it's transmitted to different communities. So they put up these big speakers and they broadcast this information at a much more local level. Thank you. Mao, do you have anything to say about this? How you can involve audiences and the public in the coverage of Indigenous stories? Involve? Yes, but you're talking about non-Indigenous audiences, aren't you? It could be an Indigenous public or a non-Indigenous public. When you think about the Indigenous audience, it's completely different to talking about a non-Indigenous public. What works best for us as Indigenous people is sound, or to listen to someone who's talking to us. I'm talking about the Arhuaco group. We're attracted more to auditory storytelling than watching a story. So if you have a really well-recognized mamo sitting still and telling us a story, we can pay attention for half an hour or an hour. But when you talk about a non-Indigenous public or audience, 10 seconds of the same image is enough. It's tiring. You have to change it when you want to attract the attention of a non-Indigenous audience. So that's why it's always important to think about what kind of audience you are directing your story at. Are you working with an audience of children, an academic audience, etc.? But there's an enormous gap there, a difference between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous societies. I believe, well, many years ago, Indigenous knowledge was not valued, and nobody wanted to hear about it or listen to it. But as that has changed due to climate change and the different impacts that await us as a result of climate change, we see that scientific knowledge or science isn't sufficient to respond to what's happening on the planet. But for us, this is our daily bread and butter as Indigenous peoples, because it's the kind of thinking that has always directed us, oriented us. I think that's what I wanted to say. When it comes to images, you need to think about the resolution that you're going to film in and how you're going to edit those images to attract a non-Indigenous public. But I would say that it's easier for us as Indigenous people to attract a non-Indigenous public than the other way around. During this pandemic, we've realized that no weapons, no money, no science has been able to escape this pandemic. Thank you very much, Amalo. Okay. I think at the end of the day, we all share what Gabo said. I want to try to be remembered or loved for a good story I've told. So whether this story is told from an Indigenous narrative or a more city-centric narrative, we all want to be remembered for a good story. And we can use the greatest traditions of oral narratives amongst Indigenous peoples and incorporate those into our narratives. Thank you, Tom, Amal, and Nelly. Thank you to the whole technical team that made this event possible. And before we say goodbye, I'd like to remind you that we still have 2 seminars on the 22nd and 29th of September, and registration will be open for the Premio Gabo this year, the Gabo Prize, in the text, image, coverage, and innovation categories. If you'd like to read the criteria, please visit the Fundación's website, fundaciongabo.org. Please present your best work. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center, to the Foundation, and thank you to all of you for being with us today.
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible. Al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar. Apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.